Everyone, and good afternoon and good evening to those who may be joining us from around the world. I'm Suzanne Maloney, Vice President and Director of Foreign Policy here at the Brookings Institution. On behalf of all of us at Brookings and at Foreign Policy, it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this event celebrating the new book, Soldiers of Democracy, Military Legacies in the Arab Spring by my colleague Sharon Grewal. Sharon, congratulations on this very important book, which makes significant contributions to our understanding of the role of militaries in the Arab Spring. Along with your other research, Soldiers of Democracy offers a clearer picture as we look back at those uprisings and understand their many ongoing implications. This clarity is especially important as we seek to understand how and why Tunisia, which is the focus of our discussion today, has experienced dramatic backsliding into authoritarianism in recent years, especially since President Kais Saied's power grab on this day in July 2021. It's a real honor to be able to kick off this event today, and I'm very eagerly looking forward to the discussion. Before I hand the microphone over to our moderator, please allow me to offer very brief introductions of our great lineup of speakers. Sharon Grewal is non-resident fellow in the Center for Middle East Policy at Brookings. He is also an assistant professor of government at the College of William and Mary and a non-resident senior fellow at the Project on Middle East Democracy. He received a doctorate in politics from Princeton University in 2018, and Sharon's research examines revolutions and democratic transitions across the Middle East and North Africa. Mohammed Dia Hamami is a PhD student in political science at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. He previously studied mathematics and physics at the University of Tunis and statistics and data analysis at the University of Carthage. Dr. Aya Jurad is a resident fellow at the NATO Defense College and assistant professor of security studies and comparative systems in Tunisia. She is also the founding director of Al-Mashkat for Applied Research and Technical Assistance, a consulting firm committed to supporting emerging leaders, strengthening organizational capacity, and informing public policies. Dr. Jurad holds a PhD in international relations law. Erin Claire Brown is our moderator for today's discussion. She also serves as the North Africa editor at New Lines magazine, where she writes about Tunisia and commissions reporting from across North Africa. Her many accomplishments as a journalism include 2 years as the Tunis correspondent for The National, where she reported on Kais Saied's consolidation of power, among other important topics. This is, after all, a book launch, so it's my duty to encourage all of you to purchase a copy of Sharon's great book. It's available online and linked on the webpage for this event. My colleague, Nikki Sullivan, will also drop a link in the chat along with a promo code. Finally, please note that our event today is on the record. Please feel free to send in your questions using the chat function in Zoom and to continue the conversation on social media using the hashtag #TunisiaMilitary on Twitter and other social media. Thanks very much, and I'm pleased now to hand it over to Erin to moderate our discussion today.
Thanks, Suzanne, so much for that lovely intro, and welcome, everyone. We are so excited to be here. I'm going to give us a quick little intro, and then we're going to dive right into the conversation. We're going to try and keep to the time schedule. So the conversation among our panelists will go for about 40 minutes, and then we're going to have about 10 minutes for Q&As. If you've got questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. We've got a couple of people moderating and watching that. We'd love to engage with you guys. There's a lot of really interesting things we'll be talking about today. So feel free to hop in and send your questions our way. So here we are on the 25th of July, 2023. 2 years ago on an equally scorching July afternoon, and I can tell you it is scorching in Tunis today where I am. Hundreds of protesters crowded outside of Tunisia's parliament. They were shouting slogans against the then Prime Minister, Hisham Mashishi, and the Speaker of Parliament, Rashid Ghannouchi. They wanted the government dissolved. And it's because the country really was in turmoil. We were in the grips of a brutal wave of the Delta variant of COVID, with hospitals overflowing and oxygen in short supply. Actually, earlier that week, I had been down at the Charles Hospital in downtown Tunis and was reporting. And when I asked a young resident what the line of people outside the ER was all about, he said pretty matter-of-factly, "Oh, they're waiting for someone to die so they can take their bed." Curfews and lockdowns weren't working. The vaccine rollout was a mess. The economy was continuing its nosedive that began, sort of slowly in 2015 or even earlier, depending on who you ask. Meanwhile, and I'm sure some of you remember these days vividly, maybe even fondly, there were fistfights on the floor of the parliament, and Abir Musi was wearing a motorcycle helmet and a stab vest into the chamber. Long story short, it was a circus. So when late on the night of July 25th, Kais Saied took to national television to announce that he was sacking his own government and freezing parliament for 30 days in what he characterized as an attempt to sort of pump the brakes on a broken system, there was no shortage of Tunisians and Tunisia watchers, for that matter, who applauded the decision. But from very early on, there were worrying signs, like right from the start, including one that we're actually going to lead out with today. That night, armored military vehicles drove up to the Bardo complex and locked the gates of parliament. Since then, Saied has taken the country on a dark ride back towards autocracy, dissolving the parliament, installing his own sort of Potemkin assembly, jailing dissident voices, often through the use of military courts, which we're also going to talk about today, and starting a racist campaign of violence against Black migrants that we're still feeling the impact of. It's 50 degrees in southern Tunisia, and there are men and women out in the desert, jettisoned between, in the sort of no man's land between Tunisia and Libya. But back to that first fateful night. Tunisia's military has long been viewed as being apolitical, but that seems to be changing. And so today we're here to talk about what those shifts are and how the international community is and maybe even should be responding to them. So let's get started. Sharon, I'm going to take the first question to you, since it deals with one of the chapters in your book, which everyone should buy. Tell us, why did the Tunisian military actually agree to close parliament that night?
Well, thank you, Erin, and Suzanne, for the very kind introduction. And thank you, everyone, for coming. I'm excited to finally get to share this book with you all after working on it for way too long. So the book overall looks at why militaries support or thwart transitions to democracy. It looks first at Egypt, trying to explain why the military there staged a coup to overthrow democracy in 2013. And then it looks at Tunisia, where the military initially supported the transition, but then seemingly abandoned democracy later on. The book tries to revise our understanding of what actually happened in Egypt and Tunisia, and from there tries to generate a broader theory that generalizes globally as well. But today I want to focus on Tunisia and why 2 years ago today, the military decided to close the doors of parliament. This was puzzling, even surprising, because this was a military that until then had been defending democracy. It had defended the revolution when it chose not to fire on protesters in 2011. And then it defended the transition by ignoring the calls for a coup in 2013. So why then today is it now facilitating President Kais Saied's dismantling of democracy, closing the doors of the parliament, hauling dissidents before military courts, even expelling migrants into the scorching desert most recently? Why are they following these orders when they seem to run counter to democracy and to human rights? What I argue in the book, based on interviews with retired officers, is that 3 factors have shaped the military's behavior and led them to obey Kais Saied's orders. For some, it's their norms. For others, it's their politics. And for others still, it's their interests. So let me unpack each of those. First, in terms of their professional norms, let me start by stating the obvious, which is that this is not what a fully professional military would do. It's not, for instance, what the US military would have done, or what at least we hope the US military would have done, if, for instance, President Trump had ordered them to close the Congress on January 6th. Because professionalism means obeying all orders, except if they are illegal or unconstitutional. In Tunisia's case, closing the parliament certainly seems unconstitutional. Article 80 of the Constitution that Kais Saied invoked to assume these emergency powers says that parliament has to remain in a state of continuous session, not frozen by military vehicles. But it's a difficult determination to make. in general, and especially in Tunisia, because the president himself is a constitutional law professor. So it was hard to say his interpretation is wrong. And the military wasn't prepared for it. The Tunisian military hadn't studied the 2014 constitution. They hadn't studied Article 80 to know the particular limits. They hadn't thought much about neutrality and what it means in practice. And there wasn't anyone for them to consult. The Constitutional Court didn't exist. And there weren't even qualified lawyers within the Ministry of Defense that they could ask about this order. And frankly, they didn't have any experience either ever saying no to the president. It's a myth that Rashid Ahmad during the revolution said no to President Ben Ali. That never happened. And so in some ways, you could say the Tunisian military wasn't professional enough, that they didn't have the tools or the experience or the knowledge to make this determination that this order was unconstitutional. But what I find is that it's also more than that. It's not just that they weren't professional enough. It's that the parts of professionalism they did know pushed them to obey these orders. The parts of professionalism the Tunisian military knows well as a result of its history is civilian control over the military. They had been kept far from power, subservient to the civilian president, and to stay far away from politics. Those two principles led them to obey on July 25th. The culture of being subordinate to the president led them to defer to his interpretation that this was legal and constitutional. And the desire to stay far from politics led them to think that obeying these orders would be less political than openly refusing the order. One general told me that saying yes was simply following orders, but saying no would have been intervention into the political arena. And so, ironically, it was because of the professional norms the Tunisian military has, being subordinate to the president, trying to stay far from politics, that led them, therefore, to close the parliament. So norms, this incomplete professionalism, that is one reason why they decided to close the parliament. But there are also two other factors that I find mattered in the book. One are their political preferences. Many of the military officers had come to embrace Kais Saied's populism and this desire to clean up the political system, in part because they had been kept far from politics historically. Once they finally saw politics up close under democracy, for them it felt chaotic, it felt inefficient. The parties were just acting in their own partisan interest, trying to win elections. And that led them to latch onto Kais Saied's populist rhetoric. In 2019, 2020, I remember after Kais Saied's election, I was routinely hearing retired officers echoing Kais Saied's narrative that all the parties are corrupt, that they only want power and money. And in the weeks prior to the coup, a petition started circulating among retired officers that the president needs to take action. He needs to clean up the system. Democracy requires parties with some integrity, and we don't have that here. And ironically, the officers viewed this as apolitical, that I'm criticizing all of the parties. I'm not aligning myself with any of the parties, therefore I'm apolitical. But in reality, it was very political behavior. To support a populist president against all of the political parties is very much political. And so it was that politicization, that embracing of Kais Saied's populism that led them to support the president closing the parliament as well. The final factor that tipped the scales and led them on July 25th to close the parliament were their interests, their corporate interests. Historically, the military had been marginalized in Tunisia. Previous dictators had kept them far from political power, had neglected them materially in terms of budget and salaries. Things improved for the military after the revolution, During the transition, the military saw its budget increase more quickly than any other ministry. It saw political influence for the first time in the form of advisory positions to the president. And those gains after the revolution is one reason why the military didn't stage a coup in 2013. But Kais Saied took advantage of that and advanced their interests even further, securing their support for his takeover. Politically, the military under Kais Saied has now expanded its influence beyond traditional security issues. Now they're involved in health. Kais Saied, prior to the coup, tasked the military with the COVID-19 response and appointed 2 military doctors as ministers of health. And after the coup, the military has now expanded into agriculture. Food security has become a national security issue as well after the war in Ukraine. And Said has appointed a military general now as the Minister of Agriculture. And this is new for the Tunisian military. It hasn't had many ministerial positions before. Only 4 officers prior to the revolution had ever become ministers. Now you've had 4 already in the last 3 years. So beyond that, so political power, and beyond that, you've also seen a growing budget despite COVID, despite the poor economy, and you've seen the top generals also have personal interests in sticking with Kais Saied. He has promoted these top generals earlier than usual, or ahead of schedule, promoted them to higher ranks, likewise securing their support. So in short, those 3 factors, the military's norms, their politics, and their interests, led it to obey Kais Saied's orders. All 3 of those, in some way, stem from the same root cause, which is how the Tunisian military had been treated under dictatorship. It's under dictatorship that it developed this culture of being subordinate to the president. It's under dictatorship that it was kept far from power and thus embraced Kais Saied's anti-system populist politics. And it's under dictatorship that they were neglected, and thus it was relatively easily co-opted by Kais Saied through their interests. So in short, what I argue in the book is that it's the type of military that Tunisia's democracy inherited from dictatorship that made it more susceptible to facilitating a presidential coup like Kais Saied's on July 25th. I want to close with one final thought, which is, would it have made a difference if the military had refused on July 25th? Would that have saved Tunisia's democracy? On the one hand, the police could have closed the parliament on their own. Kais Saied didn't need the military per se. But the military, being the most trusted institution in Tunisia, gave his takeover considerably more popularity. And even more importantly, it created the image that everybody supports what Kais Saied is doing. All the state institutions are united behind him. And therefore, that any resistance would be futile. There's no hope of getting any defection from within the regime. And thus, the military's behavior was decisive in how swiftly and frankly smoothly Kais Saied was able to take power and dismantle democracy. And so that's why it's important that we do ask today why the military obeyed these orders. And I hope the book provides one plausible perspective as to why. Thanks.
Great, super fascinating. I have a million follow-up questions, but I'm going to save them for later. And we're actually going to bring Aya in here to talk a little bit about something that I kind of teased at the top of our session here. And that is the way in which Said has subsequently started using various aspects of the military to help him maintain and sort of garner more control. And that is the military court system. So, you know, Said is not the first president in Tunisia to use military courts to try civilians. You know, I can think, you know, both Ben Ali and Beji Caid Essebsi did so. You know, I recently, you know, a few months ago had a chat with Yassine Ayari, who was tried in front of military courts for supposedly insulting the armed forces under Essebsi. But it's an odd and unsettling trend that Said has really sort of picked this up and run with it. So can you talk to us, sort of talk us through why the military does this, and what the ramifications are for civilians and dissidents who are tried under the military system as opposed to the civilian courts.
Okay, yes. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. And thank you, Sharan, for this very exhaustive brief of your book. I'm really looking forward to getting my copy. So yes, Aaron, let's say it's a tradition to try civilians in military court in Tunisia, except I think the pace and the numbers have increased considerably. I remember a report from Amnesty International last year reported that the number of civilians tried before military court between the years 2011, 2018 were 6 civilians. While now, since 2 years ago, I think we have arrived to the number 15 or something. So the numbers have increased considerably. So yes, there has been an instrumentalization of military courts before, but now the pace and the numbers are very, very alarming. There is something else I need to note before maybe starting to talk about the military court's role in Tunis, is that there is no cohesive position of the military in Tunisia about the 2021 dynamics. There are the ones who are loyalists, who are partisan of Qais Said, but there are also those who are very professional and those for whom the reputation of the military is of the most importance. So we really need to highlight this from the beginning, and maybe that difference is key to identifying entry points and future entry points for Tunisian partners in the future. So how and why did the military do so? The military court and military justice do so since 2021? Because they could, because the legal system in Tunis allows military court to prosecute civilians, whether the Code of Military Pleadings and Penalty or other specific laws, such as the law of 82 on the offenses committed by security forces. So there are legal texts that allow to try civilians under specific circumstances before military courts that have been instrumentalized since 25th of July. But most importantly, the power of the executive in the military justice. The president of the Republic in Tunis has power to appoint judges, to appoint public prosecution representative in military courts after proposal from the Minister of Defense and the Minister of Justice. So the grab of the executive on the military court is very clear and very obvious, so that the military justice is not that autonomous as the civilian justice. And I think with the exception of the case known as the airport incidents or the airport case where deputies Saibdi Makhlouf and Abdelatif Al-Alwi, etc., and Mahdi Zadoub, of course, have been prosecuted before the military court because of under the law on offenses committed by security forces. All of the rest, I believe, of civilians who have been tried before the military system have been tried because of freedom of expression offenses or offenses related to offending the army, offending the president of the republic, offending the morale of the army, its reputation, its discipline, etc. So now the trend is that cases against civilians relying on the military code of military pleading and punishments. These are not these are not freedom of expression, it's crimes against the military, and these are not forgiven. So the new trend that the military is untouchable, the morale of the military is untouchable, is very, very clear lately. And it's very important to note that these provisions have existed since, I think, since 57 with the drafting of the code. Even if the code, some of the provision of the military code of pleading have been amended through the years, these provisions have been kept by different government, by Ben Ali, by Bourguiba, by Beji Qad Sibsi, by Marzouqi, by all of them, as a mean to prosecute civilians, but also to intimidate opposition. They were there. And ironically, political oppositions who have been prosecuted under these provisions are the ones who have been instrumental in obstructing the revisions. I believe in 2018 or during the first parliamentary term, the Democratic Bloc has submitted a proposal to revise certain articles of the military code, including to limit its field of intervention to only military personnel and not to civilian. But the Bureau of the Parliament dismissed at the time that proposal for the lack of the authority of those who initiated the proposal to amend. So since the beginning, the will to be able to prosecute civilians have been there, and it has not been amended. It was there, and it has been applied throughout the years. Also, going back to what Sharon has mentioned, the military is also mirroring the population. The military, there is this anti-system attitude caused by disillusionment after the 2011. It all has caused that the military justice also was driven by that anti-system attitude. But it's important also to highlight, and I think I will be ending on this note, to highlight that at this stage, there is a new reluctance from the military justice to be jeopardizing their reputation, their future career, and the military positioning in the country by exposure to future decisions of side. There is this reluctance to decide to prosecute more civilians under military courts. And I think that was very clear in the statement of the State General Agency of Administration of Military Justice earlier this year, I think in March 2023, when they issued a statement calling on everyone to stop involving the military justice on political tension and dragging them into the political confrontation. The message was clear, is that the military justice is deciding at this moment to maybe withdraw and pull back from political tension and to be more reluctant to prosecute civilians. If so, then the role of the military justice is taken over by those that I mentioned in the beginning, to whom the reputation of the military is of the most importance, rather than the anti-system attitude and the loyalty to the president himself. I hope that answered the question, and
yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
I'll be happy to answer any question.
We've got some more coming up in a second round, and I just want to remind our panelists we have about 15 minutes before we start taking our Q&A. So if we can keep our answers a little bit short. With that, Dia, I'm going to turn to you. I mentioned at the beginning of the session that Tunisia's military has sort of long been seen as apolitical, but that appears that it's shifting. And as Sharon mentioned, under Said, we've seen 2 ministers of health and the current minister of agriculture, I believe, are all former military men. We're seeing these kind of big shifts in norms, it looks like. So is the army changing from an apolitical force, and what does it mean if they are?
Thank you. So I think that when we talk about military norms, a form of institution, we usually overlook the way they get historically formed. As Sharon mentioned, and as he explained in the book, the dictatorship had an important role in shaping military behavior after the revolution. However, military norms, or norms in general, get formed during the formational period of the organization. So in my work, I went back and I looked at the earlier period of time during which the Tunisian military was constituted, which was shortly before Tunisia's independence, only a few weeks. And it happened in a context where initially the colonial military, and then after independence, the Tunisian armed forces was trying to get involved in the military, and the reason why, to get involved in politics. And the reason why they were marginalized in firsthand was because of a coup attempt that happened in '62. But since then, Tunisian political elites, until now, failed to properly set clear rules for the military. In the sense that when we look at the constitution of 2014, yes, there is the controversial Article 80, But during the constitution drafting process, there were attempts to set boundaries and discuss, integrate more articles in the constitution that would govern the military. But at that time, constitution makers did face resistance that signal a certain certain tendency within the defense apparatus to challenge civilian authority. We saw that even later when the Tunisian legislators decided to go through with the transitional justice process and try to uncover human rights abuses in which security forces, both from the Ministry of Interior and the Ministry of Defense, were involved in. And we saw again a resistance from the institution cooperation with the Transitional Justice Committee. So in my work, I go back historically and I see how in several instances, the Tunisian military did try and often failed to impose its political will on civilians. And when we, even during the last years, meaning after 2011, we saw an increasing political role of key figures of the military. It's difficult to understand Tunisian politics between 2011 and 2013 without looking at the role of General Rashid Ammar at that time. And what I've noticed is that through interviews with policymakers at that time, is that when it comes to military issues, Tunisian policymakers do not think necessarily in terms of norms, and they think more in terms of interpersonal and political dynamics. So ultimately, the argument that I present is that the norms remain blurry. Military officers don't know what is right and what is wrong, and they didn't know what to do when the coup happened. They didn't know if they had to accept the orders coming from the commander-in-chief of the armed forces and attack two other branches of the government, meaning the prime ministry, which we should remember that the military was deployed there as well, and the parliament, or abide by certain blurry norms that are not written anywhere. And it seems to me that's the problem that we are facing now. Yes, Qais Said did appoint military officers, active ones, as ministers, and that is in line with the disruption of the normative order that has been governing the military. And I would even add to that the formulation of the article on the professionalism of the military has been changed in the new constitution. It's no longer, the military is no longer expected to be neutral as it was in the 2014 constitution. So there is a tendency, there is an attempt to change things. But the problem with Said's way of governing is that he tends to dismantle institutions, but fail to reconstruct new ones. We are in a situation right now where it's not clear what is acceptable from the military and what is not. And that's why it's important to remind them and to them and the general population as well, because popular public opinion matters as well in decision-making at the civilian and military level, to remind them that there are certain red lines that should not be tolerated, in the sense that, for example, is a counter coup acceptable? That's something that some part of the opposition have been advocating early, and I think it should not. We can talk about this later. So broadly, yes, there is a certain dynamic within civilian military norms in Tunisia, and the main problem that there is no authority so far able to clearly define what is acceptable and what is not, and there is a need to clarify these rules.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Dia. So now we're going to shift and kind of do a second round of questions to look a little bit more at what all these changes mean for Tunisia's partners and the international community. So Sharon, I want to kick it back to you. since the revolution, the U.S. has become the largest supporter of the Tunisian military. They give everything from direct financial support to buy equipment to things like bespoke trainings for officers in the U.S., or they'll lead these big joint exercises like, the African Lion joint exercises. Even though the Biden administration determined that the military didn't play an important role in Said's takeover, the U.S. has subsequently cut funding the last 2 years for the military in Tunisia. Radwan Mesmoudi, who's on the call, has actually asked why you think the Biden administration made that determination. But then I also wanted to ask, what do those budget cuts signal as far as U.S.'s otherwise kind of milquetoast response to Said's takeover and to the degradation of democracy in Tunisia? And do you think that they should further reevaluate their support to the military? And I just want to give a quick time check. We have about 10 minutes before we want to start opening to Q&A.
Great, I'll make it quick. Short answer is yes. I do think the US should reevaluate its mill-to-mill relations with the Tunisian military. To its credit, it has put some pressure. It did cut foreign military financing roughly in half, 85 million in 2021 to 45 million. But alongside that has sent considerable mixed messages. When you still see foreign military sales going through, most recently sending aircraft, you still see joint trainings and exercises like African Lion, you still see military education and training programs continuing. It therefore reduces the impact of any sort of even half a cut in FMF. The pressure hasn't been costly enough to change the Tunisian military's calculus or therefore its behavior. And likewise, I think the determination the Biden administration made that they are still apolitical and professional and that they didn't play a decisive role in the coup is wrong, right? As I said earlier, at the very least, their professionalism is incomplete. They don't know and they don't have experience and training in the second half about what do you do when you're given an order that you're not so sure about. They don't have a mechanism for assessing its legality and constitutionality. But I think you're also seeing these troubling dynamics as well of politicization, at least in some parts of the Tunisian military, the embracing of Kais Saied's populism. And so I don't think the US should be continuing to call them fully apolitical and professional as they seem to be doing. But the reason why the US doesn't put more pressure on the Tunisian military is partly because they're worried what might happen if there is this vacuum. Would Tunisia's military turn to Russia or China instead to fill that gap? I'm skeptical that this would happen, both for the normal reasons that it's in Tunisia's self-interest to stick with the US, given its weapon systems, given its training has historically always come from the West. But beyond self-interest, I think it's also ideological. There is a ideological orientation the Tunisian military has with the West. So many retired officers have told me that they're so proud that Bourguiba made this decision to train us exclusively in the West and not in Soviet Union or in China. There is this commitment ideologically to the West that I think gives the US a bit more leverage than it thinks it has. And so lastly, what I think the US should do is, in addition to cutting aid more strongly, is to be specific about what they would want the Tunisian military to do. We don't want the Tunisian military to do anything that's outside of its purview that might politicize it further. Obviously, should not stage a coup to remove Kais Saied, but there are many things within its purview that it can do. It can end military trials of civilians, reject the cases that are coming to military justice, even revise the military code of justice to eliminate the possibility of civilians being tried in military courts. It can stop being used as a prop for Kais Saied. Whenever he summons the National Security Council to make an important announcement, it makes it seem like the military is supportive of it. They can take distance from Kais Saied visibly. And finally, a point for the US in particular is to help them set up some sort of Office of General Counsel within the Ministry of Defense that will help them vet orders. Is this legal? Is this constitutional? So they have some mechanism for next time around, if they're given an order they're not so sure about, they have some way to determine its legality. And there's also perhaps a role for IMET education and training programs to think about what professionalism means, what neutrality means when you're possibly given an unconstitutional order. So let me stop there, but yes, the US should, I think, reevaluate its relations.
Great, thanks. I'm going to turn to you just quickly. You're at the NATO College. As you know, Europe supports Tunisian military to a lesser extent, though they fund, security forces, and there's of course increased funding for border control right now. Really briefly, should Europe be rethinking their support of the Tunisian military, and if so, in what ways?
Yes, thank you. Should Europe rethink their support? Would Europe rethink their support? I think it's very important to think the feasibility of whatever we are thinking about or recommending. I'll very briefly go back to what Sharan mentioned at the beginning about the collective expulsion of foreigners, Black foreigners in Tunis, to which the military played a vital role in the expulsion, but also the abuses that happened to the foreigners. And I think the growing role of the military in with regard to migration is something that Europeans would not like to reassess or rethink of. It's important that there are human rights benchmarks, there are clear, verifiable with the military intervention. Would that be possible? I am not sure about it, especially that the security of Tunisia and the region impacts directly the security of European countries. It's also important to note that revision of Shara mentioned the possibility of revision of the military codes and the military laws. I think the new constitution, the 2022 constitution, had abolished the transactional provision in which it says that the military justice laws will be revised. So to think that the laws and the codes will be revised is not something in the Qais Said is thinking of, or something that in the short term it's thinkable. At least conditioning the support to some human rights benchmark with the military is something that Europe should do and Europe should think about. I don't think the military will be very opposing to these conditions if they are negotiated in a very diplomatic way. But cutting ties and would not be thinkable within this new dynamics in the country.
Excellent, thank you. And finally, before we turn to some audience questions, Dia, do you want to talk to us about how civil society and opposition parties in Tunisia should react to these changes in the military? We've been talking about outside partners, but there's a lot of other components to consider inside the country.
I'll try to be very brief. I think the opposition should refrain from either attacking or calling for intervention of the military in any way. And this should be very clear. Simultaneously, the opposition should try to raise awareness, and civil society as well should be included in this, awareness among the civilian elite on what is acceptable and what is not when it comes to civil-military relations, and prepare for the next stage, in the sense that if Tunisia has the chance to re-democratize, we would have at that time, and we would have faced the need for civilian elites who are able to properly govern the military without without doing purges or without triggering any sentiments that would prevent the military from being interested in preserving democracy. And this is something that the Tunisian opposition did not work on during the last years of Ben Ali regime, and that had important consequences during the democratic experience.
Oh, that was quick. Thank you. That was great. I mean, before we turn to our audience questions, I just want to say thank you to all three of you. I mean, we could have this conversation for hours. There's so much to ask and so much to dive into. And we have been enriched by your knowledge and research. I'm super excited, Sharon, to get your book and dive in. So I want to turn to a couple of questions from our audience that have come through both before the session and during. Let's just start. And you guys can decide amongst yourself who's going to take what, but can we talk through what some future scenarios might look like with Said and the military? Neil Patrick has asked, without his own party machine to penetrate the rank and file and officer class of the military, does Kais run the risk of being overthrown by one of his own empowered generals? That's obviously a question that a lot of people have been asking, but what, other than a sort of traditional coup d'etat, what are some possible scenarios of how the military and Said will grow and change in the coming months and years? Sharon,
I think
go
I can,
for it.
or go ahead.
Whoever.
Sure, I can take it first. So future scenarios, always difficult to predict. I do think a coup is less likely in terms of a traditional military coup, in part because although the norms are evolving, they are sticky to some degree. They're slow to evolve. And this culture that they do have of obeying the civilian president, being subordinate to the civilian president, that is strong. And so I don't think it is likely that they will themselves remove Kais Saied. Of course, if things get into a crisis mode, if you have major labor strikes in response to subsidy cuts and the economy is crashing, you never know what will happen. But I think a coup is unlikely for those reasons. And the reasons I say that the norms to some extent are still sticky is that even when you see the military officers who have become ministers now, so the Minister of Agriculture, for instance, he's never presented as even retired military. No one refers to him, even Kais Saied does not refer to him as a retired general. He's presented and he visibly looks as civilian, not in uniform. And I think that's important for showing that the norm to some degree is still there about respect for civilian control. So I do not think a coup is a likely scenario, but if things go into a crisis mode, if the military is asked to put down protests, then I think things can get a bit dicey. But let me pass it over to others.
Yeah, you have your hand up.
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes. About the possibility of a coup, I agree with Sharan, but also very important to think about the future. The likelihood of authoritarian is quite high, and any new government that will inherit military that have autonomy and resources, in any attempt to limit these privileges or adopt a more restrictive policy toward them that would dissatisfy the military will have incentive and capacity to shut down any possibility of democratic survival. So just be aware of the satisfaction of the interest of the military, and then the future capacity and capability of limiting those capacity is a bit risky for any future government. That's it.
Yeah. Dia, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yes, sure. I'm more concerned of a potential scenario where something would be backed potentially by military officers led by civilians. It will be consistent with the widely held agreement on civilian control. But at the same time, I think because of the historical precedents, like the scenario of Ben Ali in 87, or the more recent coup attempt, or we know also that many political actors domestically have been calling for military intervention in politics, and so that's my main concern. I don't know what the level of public support to military intervention are right now, but the World Value Survey showed that they have increased between the beginning of the shortly after the revolution and 2019, shortly before Said's access to power. So support for military intervention did increase, and if military behavior is dependent on public support, that might be also be something. So I don't think that we can totally dismiss the possibility of the scenario. But I think, as both Aya and Sharon said, a military-led classical conventional coup of the post-colonial era, I don't think we're gonna see these anywhere anymore. I mean, or maybe no. But specifically in Tunisia, I'm more concerned, as I said, civilian-led coup that might be potentially supported by or accepted by security actors.
Yeah, okay. So we've got a bunch of really great questions coming in, and we're going to take a few more, and then we might do a kind of lightning round style one. There's one that I wanted to pick up on from Manji Dahwadi. Oh man, you guys are going to have to forgive me. I'm like doing this on a tiny screen while I have my other one. Anyway, basically, Sharon, saying that in a way, maybe there's a little bit, maybe you're going a little bit soft on Tunisia's military leadership. He says it's a weak leadership that treats its position as a job and is not professional and it's not professional to clearly violate the constitution by shutting the parliament down when the constitution clearly asks for it to stay in session. It's not professional to violate human rights by jettisoning people into the Sahara. Do you see human rights organizations filing legal action in Tunisia or in international venues against those involved in these violations, including the military leadership?
Yeah, so let me first say that, so there are a number of reasons that I outlined for why they are obeying these orders. Part of it is this incomplete professionalism, this desire to follow orders and thinking that following orders is less political. But the other aspects too, I think, are more troubling and are occurring. The politicization in terms of the embracing of his populism and the corporate interest, the gains that they are making as a result of what Kais Saied is doing, I think are really important. And I think they're especially important when we fast forward from July 25th, especially once the 30 days were up. And he had to issue a new decree because the Constitution likewise limited the emergency powers to 30 days. It was unconstitutional for it to expand further. And so the new decree that suspended parts of the Constitution later on when he dissolved the parliament outright, those are more clearly unconstitutional, even if let's say there was some questions about July 25th. And so at that point, the other explanations get a bit more credence, that there is some political loyalty, at least from some officers, towards Kais Saied and his project, at the point where it became pretty clearly unconstitutional, and at the point where it became repressive towards the opposition, towards migrants more recently, it does suggest that politicization is there and occurring and is troubling. Hence my recommendation earlier for what the US military should be doing.
Yeah, okay. I want to hop in with a question. Aya, maybe you can help us with this one. This is from John Cher. Yes. This is the part of the job that they don't tell you about, is that you have to like live read people's names. Anyway, we're grateful for your questions. Keep sending them. He says, the comment that a security vacuum in the wake of less US assistance would force a move to China or Russia is only part of the concern. What about the internal security situation in Tunisia today, and what is the role of the Tunisian military in dealing with that assessment? Would a neutered Tunisian military add or detract, and what might be the outcomes to further security or political reforms? I think that also ties into a question that we also have from an anonymous attendee. I love you, Anonymous, I can actually pronounce your name, saying that Tunisia has struggled with security challenges, including sporadic terrorist attacks in border regions, and what has the military done to combat that problem? But maybe you can hop in and give us an idea of what the internal security situation in Tunisia is today, and what the role the military has in dealing with that.
Yes, I think yes, it's true that one of the concerns at the power vacuum and the intervention of other global powers, but the security condition in Tunisia is also very important. And I think the dilemma of the military between being the role model and the role expansion into more intervention in politics and more policing of the country as well is a debate that should be open, so that we really get a sense of where the military stands. But so far, the military's role expansion with regard, they have intervened in the health situation, they have intervened in policing of the country. So their role is really expanding beyond the traditional role of protecting the territories of the country. And that expansion of the role is problematic in the sense that, as I said, whenever a new government comes in and tries to limit those expansions, whether in resources, autonomy, or powers, it's going to be very problematic. And to what extent are national parties and civil society and opposition, etc., capable of putting the words out and discussing this, and international partners, or also are they capable of discussing this without creating tensions and without the national partners being accountable before the law for violating the morale of the army? It's a very sensitive balance to work on and walk on and discuss. And I think the role of the military in securing the country, and now with the migration crisis, is evolving, and that should be definitely discussed openly, whether nationally or internationally.
Yeah. Okay, we are nearing the end of our time. We have one last question. Oh, Dia, did you want to hop in and say something super quick before we take our last question?
Yes. So usually in democracies, the military does not intervene almost at all in domestic affairs unless you have really exceptional situations. But historically, the role of the military was not defined in that way. When Defense Minister Ahmed Nastiri was in charge in the Bourguiba, he poses this problem and suggested that the role of the military should not be limited to the defense, to military technique, and had to be involved in other activities, and such as road construction projects and other types of intervention. And this is where the problem is, that historically it was normalized, became a norm, accepted among civilian elites before even the military, to use and to deploy the military beyond what it should do. So here there is decisions that have to be made. Should the military be involved only in the protection of Tunisia from external threats, or should it be involved? And so far, I'm not seeing it going in that direction. I'm seeing it getting more and more involved in domains that should be monopolized by civilians.
That's a great point. And finally, I'm just we've got 3 minutes left on our webinar, so I'm going to give the last word to Sharon. This is a kind of mashup of a couple of different questions from Gregory, from Rosa, and from others. How does the military actually see the behavior of the Said regime? You know, his entourage, the ideologues, the new political elites and bureaucrats, et cetera, you know, the sort of machine that keeps Said up. And do they worry about their reputation if they continue to help, you know, prop up the Said regime?
Great. Let me answer a couple of questions. First, the previous one about security threats, and is that why the US wants to keep providing assistance? I think in 2012 to 2016 or so, we could say the security threats were severe. When you had the groups in the Shambi Mountains, the ISIS attacks in 2015, the attack in Ben Gardan 2016, their security threats were the #1 priority, and it made sense to increase US military assistance and the military's budget. 2017 onwards, less so. In 2017, in fact, Essebsi cut the military's budget for the first time since the revolution, recognizing that the security threats had receded. There are small-scale attacks, seemingly lone wolves here and there since, but is really receded in priority. If you look at public opinion polls as well, Tunisians themselves are not so much scared of terrorism. Their priorities are the economy and health at this point. And so in that sense, I don't think that provides justification for increasing, for maintaining even US military assistance. Just final one point to close on the military's reputation. I do think they are concerned, both internationally, their reputation, also domestically, and that can shape their calculations. If there is additional US pressure, domestic pressure, I do think the Tunisian military will change their behavior. They do care and highly value their reputation and their image in society.
Excellent. Thank you, Sharon. And thank you to all of you. We had such amazing audience engagement with this, this panel. There are so many fascinating and important questions in the chat that we didn't even get to. I hope you will reach out to the panelists individually to start more conversations. Take your questions to Twitter. We're out there, we're answering. And most importantly, go buy Sharon's book. There is a link in the webinar chat of where you can buy it and a code to get 30% off, which is a great deal. It's available in the US. And Sharon, is it available outside of the US just yet?
It is, yeah, shipping from the UK.
Amazing. Okay, so go, no excuses, folks. Go get yourself a copy of the book. Thank you again for joining us today. Thank you to our great panelists, Sharon Mohammedia Hamami and Aya Jarad. We are so grateful to have all of you. And thank you to the Brookings Institution for hosting this event. And that, my friends, is all.